All right, good. So I just started the recording. Randy, go ahead and take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone. It looks like by the count that we've got a pretty good group, and I thought what I would do is share an abbreviated set of slides that I presented at the PDPW sessions about a month ago or a few weeks ago, and it really focused on feed testing, and I know Paul's got everyone muted, so I've got about 30 slides, and we'll just go through those, and then hopefully we can get you unmuted and we can have some follow-up questions. But certainly a lot of changes have taken place in feed testing at commercial labs, and that results in different reports. And so I thought it would be a good idea to review this and see if we can kind of make some sense of some of the different things that are showing up on reports that nutritionists and farmers are looking at. And largely, I think many of the changes have really come about in the past several years have been in the area of carbohydrates, and I borrowed a slide from Dr. Dave Combs that you may have seen before at some of the Team Forage in-service training meetings that have occurred fairly recently, but we look at the cell wall components being neutral detergent fiber, hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. And you can see how those can be categorized in terms of digestibility from moderate in terms of hemicellulose, low in terms of cellulose, and then finally lignin being the kind of the very rigid portion of that cell wall that is very much indigestible and also affects the digestibility of the cellulose fraction. And then we look at the non-fiber carbohydrates. Some will call that non-structural carbohydrates, and the main ones that we look at there would be starch, sugars, and pectin. And the digestibility of those components are quite high. And in terms of starch, as we've talked about a lot in recent years, the digestibility of that component can be quite variable depending on maturity at harvest and type of hybrid that we're dealing with and those sorts of factors. So how does that get embodied in the feed test reports? For those of you who have worked in the nutrition area for a number of years past, you might recall ADF, and we used ADF, acid detergent fiber, the cellulose and lignin portion to predict the digestibility. I think in more recent years the focus has been less on ADF and mostly on NDF, or neutral detergent fiber. That actually certainly embodies the total fiber in the feed, the hemicellulose, cellulose, and lignin. It's related not only to digestibility but also to intake potential. And as you look at reports, you may see just NDF, you may see little a NDF, and then finally now we're starting to see ADF, or a NDF-OM, little a NDF-OM. What are those different components? At one time, NDF was being measured by the labs without using sodium sulfite to remove some of the insoluble proteins that are in the NDF, and possibly without using amylase to remove some of the starch that might be contaminating the NDF. In recent years, Dr. Mertens got the AOAC group to approve the NDF procedure, and then the little a NDF denotes that that would include sodium sulfite to remove residue protein, and then use alpha amylase to remove starch from the NDF residue. And then finally, just in the past few years, we've heard a lot of discussion about ash and ash in forages. Ash dirt can also be a contaminant of that NDF residue. And so technically the most correct would be an ash-adjusted NDF. And so I think where things are moving would be the AOAC-approved NDF with a correction for the ash. And we'll talk about that in a little more detail, but unfortunately for now I see a lot of reports that have NDF, ANDF, ANDF-OM. All three of those will be slightly different, maybe only different by a couple percentage units, but I think the industry is moving to the far right-hand side of the slide, or to the ANDF-OM. You're also aware of lignin has been a standard component of our analyses, and we still see that percent lignin on a dry matter basis, or percent lignin as a percent of NDF. And in the past, the group at Cornell and Pete Van Soest used lignin as a percent of dry matter times a constant, that being 2.4, to predict this undigestible or indigestible neutral detergent fiber. And so we had seen that on some reports, this UNDF, but now, as we'll talk a little bit more, I think the group at Cornell has looked at this constant and found that it's not quite right. It may vary across forages. So more and more the testing labs are working with measuring undigested NDF at 240 hours as their standard measure of undigestible NDF. So lignin is there. It's certainly an indicator of digestibility, but more and more what we're seeing on the reports and what nutritionists tend to be using is the ANDF-OM and then the UNDF, undigested NDF, measured through an in vitro digestibility procedure. Okay, a little bit on ash content, and certainly some of this has come out of the Wisconsin group. Dan Undersander and Pat Hoffman and many of you have talked about ash contamination of forages. And just some numbers from some of Dan Undersander's slides looking at haylage and hay, what the average is, what the max values are that have been seen, and some of the minimums. And then talking about contamination on these high values and values above kind of what's considered to be normal mineral composition of hay crop forages, calcium, phosphorus, potassium, etc. So this is a slide that I grabbed from Dairyland Laboratories, and essentially if you look at corn silage, this is a comparison of the, on the y-axis, the ash-adjusted NDF, and on the x-axis just the NDF measured without adjusting for the ash. And you can see with corn silage really very minor differences for most samples. However, you will have a few samples where you've got a very major correction factor taking place, in that the ANDF here would be, say, 40%, or here's some samples where the adjusted NDF may only be 20 or 30%. And so not a lot of samples, but there are some samples with significant ash contribution coming from contamination, possibly in the field, possibly during packing. And so it really eliminates the overestimation of the NDF when you use the ash correction. When you go with haylage, you can see there are more samples now, as you might expect, that are showing more discrepancy from the line of equality due to contamination of the NDF with ash, and the ANDF procedure removes that. If you look at the average correction for corn silage, it's very small, 0.8, so a 40% NDF sample. If you do the ash correction, maybe 41.2, whereas with hay crop forages, alfalfa forage, for example, the average correction is 1.7 percentage units, nearly 2%. So 40% NDF, the ADF-OM maybe 38% or 38.3%. So that's kind of the difference in what you're seeing. And as I mentioned, most people are moving. In the future, I think we're going to see more and more movement to the ANDF-OM, and I would suspect that over time on the reports, the ANDF or NDF numbers will begin to disappear. If you look at the non-fiber carbohydrate side, unfortunately that has always been estimated by difference, so 100 minus the protein minus the NDF, and hopefully corrected for protein, as well as now going to be corrected for ash, minus the ether extract minus the ash. And being a difference calculation, that's certainly subject to a lot of error in the other methods, and we do have very good analytical techniques to measure starch, so I put a check mark. And so now typically we're looking at starch in addition to non-fiber carbohydrate on the reports. We're also starting to see sugars. Those analytical techniques are not as advanced. The NIR calibrations are not as advanced. So I'm not going to put a check mark there, but certainly you'll see that on reports. We're also seeing now on silages the lactic acid, acetic acid, propionic acid. So more and more, rather than just being able to subtract out organic acids, we can also look at the actual concentrations that we're measuring. And more pectin or soluble starch is something very important, but unfortunately we don't have the analytical techniques to measure that routinely, and certainly not the NIR calibrations. So the big one here that we've kind of added to our toolbox, so to speak, in terms of feed testing has been starch, and from that we've also worked into some measures of starch digestibility. Really, the genesis for a lot of the in vitro testing that is being done in labs comes from the movement many years ago away from estimating energy from ADF prediction equations to actually summing the nutrients provided from digestible protein, digestible fat or fatty acids, digestible NFC, which in the Milk 2006 program we broke out into digestible starch, digestible NDF, and then the digestible non-starch NFC, which basically be the digestibility of sugars and organic acids, which is virtually 100%. So with the advent of this ODARC summative equation and the adoption by the 2001 NRC, the labs were pressed into trying to estimate digestibilities at least of starch and certainly of NDF. So I think that's been a major driver, as well as the research that's related digestible NDF to intake potential of cattle. So really, I think that's why in the past probably 10 years we've seen such a push to trying to measure digestibility in the labs. When the equation first came out, these were simple digestibility constants that would be multiplied times crude protein, for example, or starch or NDF, but more and more the labs have taken on trying to assess digestibility of at least of fiber and starch. So that brings me to the different procedures, and I just want to share a little bit about terminology. We'll hear in vitro or in the laboratory. That's usually referring to procedures where you have a rumen fistulated cow, rumen cannulated cow, and you can take rumen material, bring it to the lab, hopefully keep that at the proper temperature, keep it anaerobic, keep it buffered, and allow that to receive a sample of the test feed or test forage in question, finely ground, put through the procedure, and be able to measure the amount of NDF or the proportion of NDF that's remaining after a certain time period, maybe 30 hours, maybe 48 hours, could be 240 hours if you're trying to assess the undigestible NDF. Also, at least one lab in the state, Rock River, has been using quite a bit of in situ or in sacco to measure starch digestibility in the rumen. And that basically is a research technique that we've often employed in university research trials, where you take the test feed, you put it into a Dacron bag, a very fine mesh that allows bacteria to get in, but hopefully fine enough that most of the fine particles do not escape. And then it's simply incubated those bags in the cow's rumen of a fistulated, cannulated cow for, again, some time period. Could be 24, could be 48, could be 240 hours, and measure the amount or proportion of that residue, fiber or starch, that's remaining in the bag after that time period. And then lastly, on the far right is a gas production system, and that's really been advocated quite heavily by Pioneer DuPont in recent years as a diagnostic tool for assessing primarily TMRs, but also forages. that gas production system is really, I would call a fermentability index. So it's going to be all the gas produced from the rumen fluid incubation of that test sample, all the gas produced from both starch, sugar, non-fiber carbohydrate, as well as NDF fermentability. So it doesn't really distinguish directly the digestion of NDF versus starch, but there is kind of some complex math and curve fitting that goes in to really break out the starch non-fiber carbohydrate versus fibrous carbohydrate. And then lastly, what we're really trying to do with all this is hopefully mimic in vivo just being kind of a scientific term for in the cow or in the pen or in the herd, trying to mimic how the cow might utilize that test feed if it's fed. So this brings me to a long list of different types of digestion coefficients or outcomes from these different analyses that may be showing up in reports. And you can see there's not a lot of consensus. What I have here is a survey of websites and test reports of the 4 major U.S. dairy feed labs. And so basically I've captured Dairyland Labs, Rock River Labs, Dairy One Labs in Ithaca, New York, and Cumberland Valley out in near Hagerstown, Maryland. And so you can go down the list. The traditional NDF digestibility is the old Van-Soest method. There's a standardized procedure developed by Dave Combs here. I believe that's only being employed at this point at Rock River Labs here in Watertown. We've also got an in vitro total tract NDF digestibility that we'll talk about some more. That utilizes that Combs-Gazer technique, and again, that's being offered, I believe, only at this point at Rock River Labs. Then we've got a variety of KDs, or rates of digestion, which involves multiple time points in vitro or in situ type systems. And a lot of these come out of the Cornell approach and really attempt to fit this into the Cornell model, which is used in several ration formulation programs. And you'll see bits and pieces of most of these on a lot of the different reports, whether it's Rock River and Dairyland Labs or Cumberland Valley or Dairy One. And then finally at the bottom is this concept of UNDF. Some will say INDF, but for all practical purposes, they're really the same thing. And the one that's most related to lignification of the NDF is this 10-day digestion in rumen fluid. Could be in sacco in the bags, or most commonly in vitro, and it's become kind of an estimate of the indigestibility or undigestibility of that feed stuff in the cow or in rumen fluid. So that previous slide just focused on NDF. The other major area is starch digestibility that's been looked at. A lot of this now would focus on work done here, either when Pat Hoffman was at Marshfield or myself or collaboration. You'll see the starch concentration, prolamine, ammonia in corn silage or high moisture corn being an indicator of the breakdown of the prolamine and an increase in starch digestibility. Certainly particle size in corn grain, the feed grain evaluation system, and then the corn silage processing score. All of these are very much components of many test reports. Some groups are looking at either a 3-hour or a 7-hour look at ruminal starch digestibility. There's a lot of error in the 3-hour, so most commonly what labs are using would be a 7-hour incubation in vitro or in situ in the cannulated cows. And then finally, one that we've worked at with an extension in some of our field work a few years ago, fecal starch, and an estimate of total tract starch digestibility has really become pretty common as a diagnostic tool and can be requested and does show up on many of the diagnostic test reports. And then lastly, just a quick slide for assays that may show up that can be requested that really take into account both starch and NDF together. TMRD was developed by Dave Combs and John Gazer. And so that's one where you can sample manure as well as the TMR and come up with an estimate of nutrient digestibility. I mentioned the Fermentrix that comes out of Canada. That's the gas production system, and really being used and promoted most heavily by the Pioneer DuPont group. Calibrate is a trademarked system of Perina Mills Land O'Lakes that will show up upon request on some reports. Again, kind of a focus on starch and NDF digestibility simultaneously. And then finally, there is an index that shows up on the Least Cumberland Valley's reports, which tends to try to relate the fiber digestibility and starch to fermentability and feed intake of the cow. Okay, so for these ruminal in vitro and in situ digestibility measures, I think the way they need to be viewed is mainly as a relative index, and they can be useful for comparing across feeds or diets. They can be useful for comparing over different times of the year within those feeds. They certainly can be used to compare across clients that a nutritionist may have, but most of them are really not very good predictors of this in-cow or in vivo type digestibility measures. There either hasn't been enough work done, or when it has been done, it hasn't proven out very well. There are some exceptions to that I'll mention here in the next few slides, but I think people need to keep this in perspective, and that there's not a direct relationship in most cases between the digestibility measures and what the cows do in terms of digestibility, at least. And I think that needs to be kept in mind. Useful for comparative indexes, though. The exception to that is this Cornell approach with the Cornell model. And the Cornell model has now been licensed by two major ration formulation firms, NDS and AMTS. And so a lot of our client nutritionists in the field would be using one of those two methods. And those really require either book values for these rate constants or some laboratory measures. And so that's really the rush to a lot of these different techniques, multiple time points, and various rate constants that I showed you on that one slide relative to NDF. Obviously, that hasn't been sorted out particularly well because there's many different approaches, but that's really why those numbers are being generated, not so much for comparative purposes or indexes or even to predict in vivo responses directly, but more to seed these ration balancing programs. I would also point out that if we don't have enough confusion amongst the different models and amongst the different rate constants and those sorts of things, that NRC is being updated. The last update was 2001. That's now quite a long time ago. Obviously, the committee is working very diligently right now, and I suspect within the next 2 years we will have another nutrient requirement of dairy council book out, or nutrient requirements of dairy cattle book out from the NRC committee. And along with that will be a requirement that they come up with a model, and that model will likely have different inputs and maybe different rate constants. So it's certainly a stay tuned. And that'll probably sort out some of the other confusion. Some of these other tests may go by the wayside. I just point out the input that we would have on the committee. It's probably a 12-member committee selected from the land-grant institutions primarily around the U.S. Dr. Rich Erdman is the co-chair of that committee. I point that out because Rich was a Fort Atkinson farm boy who went to the University of Maryland, or University of Maryland on the faculty, but grew up in Wisconsin and then went to River Falls for his undergraduate and ended up on the faculty, so Wisconsin tie. I also trained for my master's degree with Rich. But then more closely aligned would be Dr. Lou Armentano from our department and Dr. Mary Beth Hall from the Dairy Forage Research Center. So we do have certainly some Wisconsin ties to that committee. And that's something that we will obviously be doing a lot of programming on when that comes out and as it gets closer, and will certainly impact a lot of the feed test reports and feed testing that's going on right now. So stay tuned for that. So I meant to mention just briefly just the lack of relationship or calibration between in vitro and in situ and in vivo. A couple exceptions to that. One would be my colleague Dave Combs has really done a nice job with his TT-ND-FD procedure, an in vitro procedure that he's developed along with his students, of trying to relate that back to the dairy cow. And in Dave's procedure, you would be taking a forage sample. It would be run through an in vitro procedure that he standardized with primers and a lot of different methodology. And it's run at multiple time points, 24, 30, and 48 hours, and then 240 hours to set the rate of digestion as well as the undigested pool. And you can see he goes into kind of a modeling approach, basically a fiber submodel to estimate a rate of digestion, a potentially digestible NDF, and then he assumes a rate of passage based on the level of production, the level of intake of the herd, and then essentially calculating at the end a total track NDF digestibility measure. This is some data that was published. I've adapted all of these slides from Dr. Combs. Many of you may have seen it at the recent in-service training up at West Salem. But basically what we can see, if you take his output of total track NDF digestibility in vitro versus what the cows told us from I believe it was seven different experiments conducted here at the UW, a pretty nice relationship explaining here 66% of the variation. And the other thing is a very close relationship numerically between in vitro and in vivo. So 45% in vitro hits pretty closely to 45% in vivo. So the number is kind of in the realm of what we actually see in high-producing dairy cattle. This would be the relationship now between a straight NDF digestibility at 30 hours, and basically we're seeing no relationship. And then on the right side would be the relationship between undigested or indigestible NDF at 288 hours. In situ or 240 hours in vitro, and essentially a relationship here, the more indigestible NDF, the lower the in vivo NDF digestibility. But again, that relationship is not as good as what it was with Dave's estimate using the rate constants along with the indigestible or undigested NDF fraction, 36% of the variation versus 66. So at least in terms of that test, and certainly from a diagnostic standpoint, that work has been done, and it has not been done in some of the other procedures. This is a graph that I think is very nice that Dave has put together for some of his more outreach or extension-related type talks. He's looking at quality parameters for NDF concentration, 40% or less for alfalfa and corn silage, or for the grasses, 45% or less being very high quality. And then if you go to his TT-ND-FD numbers, he's looking at 42 to 44% as being average, and for high quality, you'd be looking at 48 to 50% or greater as you go from alfalfa, corn silage up to grasses to be classified as very high quality. So this is certainly a test that we're going to be working more and more with. I think the challenge now is to develop good NIR equations for corn silage, for example, and maybe some of the grasses to move this forward a little more rapidly than what it has been. This is some interesting data that came out of the Pioneer DuPont group and involves likely some of your client herds. It was done by Bill Powell-Smith. I believe most of these herds would have actually been in Wisconsin, but certainly some in some of the other states. 32 dairy herds. They went out and sampled manure as well as the diet and forages to look at undigested NDF at 240 hours as an internal marker. Also measured NDF and starch content to measure digestibility, and looked at the high pens. And then they also measured the 7-hour in vitro starch digestibility or 24-hour in vitro NDF digestibility. And when they looked at that, they had no relationship between the total tract estimate of starch digestion in the cows, the actual cows by manure sampling, and what was measured in the lab. And when they went to the in vitro procedure, they also did have really no relationship between NDF and what the cows were telling you through the manure. It would be nice, and I've really talked to Bill Mahan at Pioneer, it would be nice to get these samples and be able to look at Dr. Combs's TT-NDFD procedure as well as the fermentric approach that they've been using. It might be a pretty nice calibration or validation data set from the field, but as of yet, that really has not been done. So I want to also focus on another very important test procedure that we've had some hand in, and that's been the processing score. It was actually developed here at Dairy Forage by Dr. Dave Mertens. I think many of you have seen this or had some experience, but it involves taking a sample from the lab or taking a sample from the farm, goes into the lab, it's dried, and then put through a Rotap shaker. And kind of the key sieve in there is a 4.75 millimeter sieve that retains the coarse fiber and also the coarse grain particles. And then a starch assay is done to determine the percent of the starch in the sample that either passes through that screen or is retained. And kind of the index that's been used for quality control analyses in the field or on farms has been greater than 70% would be excellent processing of the kernel, and less than 50% would be poor. We've done a lot of tracking of this over time since kernel processing came into play back in the 90s, so to speak, and I've got a summary here that goes back to 2005. And you'll see really in all these survey sample sets a very low percentage, under 20% certainly, and even under 10% in the excellent category, and then a very high proportion, in some cases just under 50% or under 40% into the poor categorization. And so we've often felt that there's certainly room to improve processing of corn silage with the equipment that we have or some of the new equipment that's coming online. This would be a summary now specifically from Cumberland Valley Analytical Labs in Maryland. So this would encompass certainly the Northeast as well as some samples out of the Midwest. You'll see where the average scores were until about 2011, when there started to be a major emphasis on processing and chopping of corn silage, more of an emphasis. And you'll see the average score increases, but more importantly, if we look here in recent years, the percent excellent has increased from where it had been, and then more importantly, from my standpoint, the percent poor has really declined pretty dramatically here in the past several years. If we take a look at Rock River Labs in Watertown, they again samples that come to them from really around the country, but I would guess it has a heavier emphasis here in Wisconsin and the upper Midwest. This only goes back to 2013, but we see kind of a dramatic increase in their average score. The normal range has increased. The minimum has increased in that, as has the max. And then you'll see the percent excellent, a dramatic improvement. And then if you look at the percent poor, quite a decline, and now down under 10%. And just to quickly show Rock River Dairyland Laboratories in Arcadia, and from 2009 to 2014, less than 50% passing the screen would be poor. You see that decreasing, and the excellent greater than 70% passing the coarse screen increasing pretty dramatically. So kind of the sum to that, some of these tests and the impact in teaching programs and diagnostics can have a pretty big impact on what's actually happening in the field in terms of quality control measures. I want to share something else that I think is pretty useful that you can likely use in your programming, but many of the reports now will not only list the analyses of that sample. This was a sample that came out of Beaver Dam, Wisconsin. I just pulled it out of my files for this presentation. It was a pile of corn silage, and you can see that sample: dry matter, moisture, pH, and then I just selected out here a few nutrients. Protein, as I mentioned, we still see ANDF and ADFOM, starch concentration here. And then that would be the sample analyses, but then you also see the average and the average plus or minus 1 standard deviation, the normal range for that sample type through Dairyland Labs for the past year. And so this allows the producer to do some bracketing or indexing relative to the rest of the samples that would go through Dairyland Labs. And if you actually go to their website, they have a pretty good database built up, as would the other labs, Rock River, Marshfield Lab, Dairy One Laboratories, Cumberland Valley, where you can pull out the averages and the normal range for various nutrients and various types of forages. And it can be pretty powerful data as a educator to use in some of the programming, and certainly as a producer or a consultant to producers. That's a pretty good way to kind of sort out whether we've got good quality, average, or below average forage in a given dairy or in a given time period. The other thing that's happened in the feed testing area is some very good work out of Ohio State University by Bill Weiss and Dr. Normand St. Pierre. And what they've been looking at is really the variation in sampling and the variation in analyses versus real variation. And what they've found is there certainly can be variation that creeps in that's unrelated to real variation in forage quality. And so they've talked about, rather than grabbing the latest sample that's coming out of a bunker silo and totally readjusting the ration based on that sample, to actually take the average of the last 3. So you would average the last 3 NDF values, and then the nutritionist would actually use that to formulate that ration. It just results in less dramatic swings in the formulation. Obviously, if you're switching from one bag to the next, you would switch to the new analyses. But within a silo, basically using a rolling average versus the individual sample that's coming out. And that's certainly been adopted or being adopted by a lot of the nutritionists. And this is an example that I pulled out of a Rock River report that I had on my computer from a farm. It's third crop haylage. But what's actually showing up here now is the average for that sample, 17.2%, and then the average of the last 3, and you can see that being 15.8. So more than likely, the nutritionist has requested that report, or this may be common to their reports, where they report the sample analyses plus the average of the last 3. And then that is likely what the nutritionist will use in the formulation. Also here again, you see a 60-day average versus a 4-year average for that sample type for comparative purposes. So the reports are providing a lot of useful information, new information than what we've previously seen. And again, as you step into some of the websites, some good information that gets shared in the databases. So with that, I'd like to stop. Hopefully Paul's back to unmute everyone, and we can take some questions or have some discussions if we have some time. I just wanted to point out my website. We've had some server issues down here, so just like Paul Fricke, I've actually had to switch my website to a different server, and just wanted to make sure you're aware of what that site is.